All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Of course, people are going to be logging on as we go, so that's okay. But for now, let's go ahead and get rolling. I'm going to pop in the chat here to make sure that everyone can see this. So I'm dropping a note in the chat, so that way you guys can kind of see over in the corner of the screen. You guys can also contribute to the chat. So if you guys have any questions as we're going, feel free to pop those up there. That way I can kind of address what you guys need. Mostly I'm just here to kind of give you a quick overview and then to answer any kind of questions you guys need. Again, just as a reminder, keep it chill in the chat. I will kick you if we have to, but I don't anticipate that to be a problem. All right, so just to kind of make sure that I'm hitting everything I need to, I'm going to roll through just a quick overview of the key concepts of this unit. That way you guys know exactly what we're focused on for the test tomorrow. For 2.1, there are three totals of it. 2.1 is talking about how states and empires increased in size and how contact between the different regions multiplied. Namely meaning that earlier on, with our early civilizations, we did have contact between different civilizations, but as we get bigger and more complex, that contact needs to continue to grow. For example, we have more contact between Rome and Greece, or Rome and Persia, Persia and Greece, Carthage and Rome. People transformed their cultural and religious systems. This is where we get more defined religions. In early Mesopotamian times, it was a little bit more chaotic. Everybody kind of had their own way of thinking about things. In Egypt, it was a lot more defined. We had a very clear theocracy from the get-go. But all of these religions kind of start to morph and change. We'll see, for example, in Greece, we have the Parthenon come up. And if we look at Rome, Rome will also kind of adapt the Greek way of thinking about their gods. They just kind of change the names because the Greeks want to be like the Romans want to be like the Greeks, but they can't really say it outright. We're also going to talk about how these religious and belief systems provide a social bond and ethical code to live by. For example, in Christianity, Zoroastrianism and Judaism, as well as the Greco-Roman Parthenon, they kind of have these morals for how we should be living our lives. We've got the dichotomy between good and evil in Zoroastrianism, and then when we look over towards the Greco-Roman side, they've got the concept of hubris. You want to kind of stay in your lane, don't rise above your post. This is the same as we look at, for example, Confucianism in China. These beliefs also influence and reinforce political, economic, and occupational stratification. Confucianism is definitely the clearest example of this. Whenever we're looking at Confucianism, it talks very clearly about the hierarchy that you're supposed to be in and how you don't really want to change from that. You want to stay exactly where you are. Be a son if you're a son, be a father if you're a father, be a ruler if you are a ruler. Religious and political authority often merged as rulers, some of whom were considered divine. For example, Augustus or the emperors of Rome were considered to be the sons of Jupiter. Use religion along with military and legal structures to justify their rule and ensure its continuation. We'll see this in Rome, and we'll also see that in China, for example, the Mandate of Heaven. Persia shows that through the Zoroastrianism, choosing their king as kind of the ruler on earth. Religions and belief systems also generate conflict, partially because beliefs and practices vary greatly within societies. We'll see that it's especially clear in Rome whenever the Jewish diasporic communities start to grow, because the Roman emperor did not jibe with the fact that they weren't worshiping him as the Son of God. And it's the same as we look at Christianity. Christians were persecuted partially because they went against Roman mythos, and also partially because they were used as scapegoats whenever we have different plagues come by or different political events. They would blame that on the smaller sect of Christians. Key concept 2.2 is talking about the early states growing in number, size, and population, competing for resources and coming into conflict with one another. This is those wars that we've talked about. We talk about Greece and Persia first. Once Greece and Persia have their conflict, it takes about 10 years and they come out on top, leaving Athens the top dog in Greece. Athens continues to grow, and this leads to conflict with Sparta. This leads to the Peloponnesian Wars, and about 30 years of war between Sparta and Athens leads to the weakening of all of Greece, and that's when Macedon takes over. As Macedon takes over, of course, Alexander the Great pushes into Persia all the way down to India, takes over a vast amount of land, and then croaks. After Alexander the Great, it splits into several different empires. We see the rise of Rome, the rise of Carthage, the rise of all of these different empires. And whenever they rise, they don't really just let the other one be. It always leads to some form or fashion of conflict. In quest of land, wealth, and security, some empires expand dramatically. The biggest example of that would be Rome and Han China. They're the ones that expanded so big that it actually helped to lead to their downfall. In doing so, they built powerful military machines and administrative institutions that were capable of organizing human activities over long distances, and they created new groups of military and political elites to manage their affairs. This is why we see the rise of, in Qin China and Han China, the rise of the military class, and it's the same thing in Rome. As people start to push further and further out, and military becomes important, the military leaders gain more power. This is how Caesar and Augustus are able to gain so much power that they start the Roman Empire rather than just the Roman Republic pushing outwards. As these empires expand their boundaries, they also face the need to develop policies and procedures to govern their relationships with ethnically and culturally diverse populations. This one is very clearly seen in Persia. We have very diverse population there because they kind of let them do their own thing. They practice this idea of tolerance. And sometimes they exclude them. And that one, again, is very clearly seen with the Jewish diasporic communities. In some cases, the success of these empires create further problems, as in Rome and Han growing further, being more and more successful. It leads down the line to them getting too big to handle and falling apart. By expanding their boundaries too far, they create political, cultural, and administrative difficulties that they can't manage. They also experienced environmental, social, and economic problems when they overutilized lands and subjects, and when disproportionate wealth became concentrated in the hands of privileged classes. Especially when we look at the way that the emperors in both Rome and in China start to gain so much wealth and power just unchecked that they stop being good leaders. And for Rome, we start to go through that crisis of the 3rd century. And in Han China, we start to see the leaders become weaker and weaker to where they're unable to deal with things like the Yellow Turban rebellion or with the external forces from the Xiongnu. Finally, with key concept 2.3, the organization of large-scale empires, the volume of long-distance trade increases dramatically. This is where we really get into the stuff that we talked about this week with the Silk Road trade, the Indian Ocean trade, and the Mediterranean trade, and the Trans-Saharan trade. Much of this trade results from the demand of raw materials and luxury goods. For example, Rome had a huge demand for pearls and peppers from India, leading to that trade that actually boosted Axum as a society because it was at one of those choke points of trade. Land and water routes link many regions of the Eastern Hemisphere, and the exchange of people, technology, religious and cultural beliefs, food crops, domesticated animals, and disease pathogens develop alongside this trade in goods across extensive networks of communication and exchange. This is what we call unintended secondary consequences. What you're trying to do is transport goods, but what you end up transporting is those goods with the cultures, the disease, the technologies, everything else that comes with it that we don't really realize when we're just trying to trade one thing for another. And finally, in the Americas and Oceania, localized networks developed. We're going to talk a little bit more about that following this test. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of open up to questions, and we already have one here from Ali Elliott. Will we need to know the trade routes specifically? We will need to know some of the trade routes specifically. I would highly suggest that you know the Silk Road, and make sure that you know that the Silk Road in Rome, Rome and Han China were the two kind of external points to that, and that they connected in the middle through nomadic people. It's very important to know that the nomadic people were the ones who really moved that through. Rome and Han both kind of knew about each other, but it was kind of on the periphery. They really did think that Han China was like at the end of the world. They didn't know anything beyond it. And since they were on the periphery, they never really tried to establish trade routes with each other. They never got close enough to really be at a militaristic point where they wanted to actually fight each other. So what ends up happening is that in the steppes of Asia, you have those nomadic people, the Xiongnu, the Huns, that start to trade because they start moving to different areas, leading to the development of several different routes that we now know as the Silk Road. So that one I definitely make sure to know. And the trade routes in the Mediterranean, mostly they stayed close to the shores. You will need to know that the Mediterranean trade, specifically with the Phoenicians, so Carthage, Rome, Greece, Alexandria, Egypt, You need to know that Asia Minor kind of also participated in this trade. So as far as the routes, you won't need to be able to identify which route is specifically on this map without any kind of indication of what is going on there. All right, I'll open it up to any more questions if we have them. Please just go ahead and type them in the chat. For me, it's right over here. I'm not sure if it's the same on your screen or not. All right, guys. If we don't have any questions, I can wrap this up as soon as needed. But I wanted to kind of make sure that you guys had the opportunity to ask any questions that y'all were concerned about. I've got one here from, hey, it's Cam Official. How much on Persepolis specifically do we need to know? For Persepolis, you really need to kind of know that that's Persia. You need to know about the royal road that connects it, and you need to know that it was one of the major sites of trade and major sites of political action in the Persian Empire. You don't need to know specifically exactly what's going on there to the minutiae detail. Lizzie is saying that she can't see anything. If this is a problem for anybody else, try just reloading. And if reloading doesn't work, I'm not quite sure what to do about that. Luciana says, can you cover the key points of Christianity? For the key points of Christianity, we need to know a couple of things. First, it is a monotheistic religion, meaning that they only worship one God. Christianity kind of comes from the Judaic tradition, and they believe that Christ was the Messiah promised by the Judaic writings in the Torah, by Judaic prophecies. He's believed to be the Son of God. He comes down during the Roman era, right around the reign of Augustus Caesar, so the first citizen, the first emperor. And what Christianity is all about, the tenets are you're supposed to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. They believe that there's one God. They believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of that God and that he's the Savior of mankind. They'll also believe in doing unto others as they would do unto you. So in other words, the golden rule. The Christians in Rome were persecuted periodically, mainly as scapegoats for big things that happened politically or whenever disease struck. And what they would do is they would round these Christians up and persecute them by either martyring them in the terms of some of the most famous saints. For example, Saint Stephen, they forced him out of the city and stoned him to death, where Stephen accepted this punishment and let that happen. You have other ones like Simon Peter, where he was actually, he requested to be crucified upside down so that he wasn't crucified in the same way that Christ was. These martyrs were basically hunted down because they were preaching ideas that were outside of the realm of the Roman Empire. And as far as Christianity is concerned, you need to know the basic tenets of it. You need to be aware of martyrdom there. And you need to be aware that we're going to be talking more and more about that as we go. Because as Emperor Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of Rome, and that continues on through Justinian and other what I would consider Byzantine emperors, it's going to continue to spread, and it will be a main focal point in our next unit on how that spreads and how it's leading up to what we'll eventually call the Protestant Reformation. Yul Kim asks, will the tests cover things back to Unit 1? The answer to that is yes, to a small degree. Unit 1 is about 5% of the AP exam, so it's going to take up about 5% of all of our exams. You need to be aware of the big ideas of the original societies, the ancient societies, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Olmecs, the Chevan, the Yellow River, and the Indus River. You need to be really focused on those. And again, big ideas, big concepts. Macedonia. Lizzie is asking me to cover Macedonia really quickly. So let me go through that. And then afterwards, there's a request from Samika to go over the main points of Han China, and I'll address that right afterwards. So for Macedonia, what happens is that Philip II of Macedonia realizes that he has a very unique opportunity following the Peloponnesian Wars. Because what you have first is you have Sparta and Athens kind of going to war with each other for 30 years. And after 30 years, both of them are exhausted. They had exhausted all their troops, their resources. They had been constantly at war. Athens loses a third of its population to plague. And things just start going downhill for all of Greece. And once they're at their weakest point and Sparta finally beats Athens, Philip II of Macedon, which is just north of most of the Greek city-states that we're talking about, pushes down into Greece and just starts conquering everything. When they finally realize that Philip II is dead, they think they might possibly get a break, but then his son, Alexander the Great, Philip II, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great takes over. And Alexander the Great takes over and goes on this massive campaign to just conquer as much land as possible. He starts by continuing to conquer some Greek land, pushes through into Persia, conquers the entirety of Persia, and then continues pushing further to conquer part of India. The reason that Macedon is so important here, number one, you conquer a great deal of land, and this is the kind of conquering model that people only wish they could emulate. And throughout history, we'll see some people rise to try and be as great as Alexander, looking at him as kind of their idol. But what he does is he actually ushers in something that we call the Hellenistic Era. Now, the Greeks weren't their own country just yet. They were a location, they were a culture, but they weren't a unified country. There were several fragmented city-states. But with Alexander the Great, he unifies Greece under a Macedonian rule and then takes the Hellenic culture and pushes it upon the people that he's conquered. So he pushes it on Persia, he pushes it on India, not all of India, but the portions that he controls. And what he does is he actually has his soldiers and his men marry people in that region and start becoming ingrained in their culture. The reason we call it Hellenistic era, not Hellenic era, is that it's not a Greek culture, it's a Greek-like culture that Alexander the Great is implementing. That being said, the citizens weren't all Greeks because they couldn't all be Greek-born, but they kind of expanded the idea of citizenship, kind of tweaked what it meant to be Greek, but by and large, the Hellenic culture was at the root of it. Now, when Alexander the Great does die, this culture remains, it just fragments into several different empires. His generals kind of take over. The two biggest ones that I wanted you guys to know about were the Ptolemaics, which are in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, which is essentially Wave 2 Persian Empire, Part 2 Electric Boogaloo. For Han China, Okay, I'm also being asked to go over the Qin, which actually fits in really well since we're just about to start off with Han. So let's go through Qin and then let's go through Han right afterwards because they kind of tie together really well. The Qin dynasty were the end to what we call the Warring States period. Now, the Warring States period are where we had roughly 26 different Chinese states fighting each other for control. And now when we talk about China, it's not the China that we know today, not the size of it, roughly about half the size of it, the half that's nearest to the ocean. What happens is that Qin does end up being able to take control of all of those Chinese states, and they do it through a few different methods. First, they use a system of meritocracy. They were the ones who required them to take the army required so many heads in order to advance. And when I say heads, I'm not speaking metaphorically, I'm speaking literally. They asked them to bring heads of their enemies, and that's how they would be able to move up. So they ended up having a military that was ruled by people who knew what they were doing. And again, this is called a meritocracy, a system of merit-based rule. Other things that helped them to gain control, even though it did end up circling around after they gained control, the thing that helped them out the most was probably their system of legalism. Legalism being written by several other people, but the most influential, I think, would be Han Fei. Legalism is all about the idea that people are stupid, they're short-sighted, and at their nature are evil. And the only thing that looks forward into the future and tries to make sure that everybody's having a good time would be the leaders, and it would be the state. And so legalism requires that that state take its foresight and use it to take care of its people, to love its people. And the way that it loves its people is by punishing them very strictly for going against the state, or for breaking the law, or basically acting in that evil sense that they think they are, or giving them very big rewards if they're doing well. So legalism is a system of big rewards and big punishments. This works out well for Qin in taking over, but once they take over, it's a very harsh system, and people don't like to be ruled that way for very long. So the Qin only lasts for about 11 years. We had two emperors. One of them killed themselves accidentally through ingesting mercury pills because, well, as a common theme is going to erupt in this region, they were looking for immortal life and ended up doing the opposite. And then after that, his second son took over, and his second son was kind of inept at ruling and does end up killing himself as well. And at this point, China's met with this fear of being plunged back into that chaotic warring states period. And this is where the Han Dynasty takes control. Once Han Dynasty takes control, with Han Dynasty, they kind of changed some of the things that Qin didn't do as well. For example, they do take away legalism. They viewed it as too harsh. They take away legalism and institute a policy of Confucianism. Confucianism is something that's going to pretty much remain a constant throughout Chinese history from there on. What Confucianism says is that, number one, you got to stay in your hierarchical place. Be a ruler if you're a ruler, be a father if you're a father, and a son if you're a son. Don't do anything different. And you're supposed to treat this with kind of a ritualistic way. Again, ritual doesn't have to be something that's overly complex. We're not talking about something that takes hours and hours. It could be something as simple as, in the South here, we like to say, yes, ma'am, or yes, sir. And that's kind of one of those ritualistic ways. It lets them know that we respect them in the way that they want to be respected. And that's kind of the ritual that we're talking about here with Confucianism. In addition, Confucianism puts emphasis on education. They believe that in order to have a strong system of rulers or a strong bureaucratic government, that you need people who know what they're doing. And so they place a lot of value on that education. And the way that the Han use that is by putting something in place called a civil service exam. Now, the civil service exam basically is an exam to prove that you are capable of running the government the way that it should be run. It proves that you are smart enough to do that. And nobody can enter the government until they've passed this civil service exam. So that's a system, again, of meritocracy, a system of only gaining your place if you deserve it. So the Han institute that, and it makes for a very strong bureaucratic government. The other thing that they do is they do start to fight these wars of expansion. They take over areas of what are now Vietnam and Korea, and they start to expand and expand. And the way they do this is through a very militaristic rule by Han Wudi, Emperor Han Wudi. And he pushes out, and in Vietnam, for example, he does run into some pushback from the Truc sisters. They posed a pretty decent rebellion, but ultimately were defeated by the Han. As they fight these wars of expansion, they also have to make sure that the state follows. The way that they do this is they, number one, have a system of roads. Just like in Rome or in Persia, the system of roads helps to not only transport goods and ideas throughout the empire, but also helps to transport the army when needed. Han will also then, the Han China will also begin to basically force Chinese culture upon the areas that they conquer. The way that they do this is through marrying into the culture and basically making sure that everybody's speaking Chinese and writing Chinese if they're writing. And the idea of this homogeneous culture, this culture that is all one culture, is that it will keep the state a lot stronger as it is. Other than that, for the Han, they also coined money. It's a circular coin with a square in the middle of it is what they did. And that looks somewhat like this. And the way that that was able to help them out, oh, I'm seeing that you guys can't see that very well. Let's try that again. Okay, it's a circle with a square right in the middle of it, and this is punched out. This is a hole. And you're able to actually string these up together, and that's how they kind of have this system of money. basically across the entire empire. So when the Han do all of this, and it becomes a very strong empire, but as with all of the other empires, eventually it becomes too big to handle. As it gets bigger, it starts to run into some troubles with nomads in the north, the Xiongnu. And they start to push into Han China, and Han has to fight against them. And after some time, they are able to defeat them, but what that does is it actually frees up some other nomadic tribes that the Xiongnu were pushing down, and they become more brutalistic. This is why Han is building a Great Wall. Again, not the stone Great Wall that you guys are familiar with, but it was more like a Great Wall of dirt. The stone wall is a little bit later in our next unit with the Ming Dynasty. The Han Dynasty not only had external forces that were starting to push against it, but also, again, when you're too big, you start to have a hard time controlling the people within your country. And so the Han started to have a little bit of problems domestically as well. The easiest example of that would be the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And the Yellow Turban Rebellion was basically a simultaneous revolt of Taoists all across the country that lasted for around 30 years. And as they were rebelling, the Han had a really hard time putting them down. Again, they were able to eventually put this rebellion down, but the damage was done. It had crippled the infrastructure, and Han at this point had such weak rulers that they were really unable to ever bounce back from that. So as the Han decline, 3 other states start to jump up, and this ushers in the era that we call the Three Kingdoms period. And that's going to lead us into our next unit. So once again, China has become fragmented after Han. The Han legacy that it leaves behind is the system of bureaucracy that none of these other empires had quite lived up to. Its system of bureaucracy and system of hierarchy continue on throughout, and that's why China is able to eventually reunify under the same culture and the same peoples. And again, that culture is because the Han implemented that idea that everybody living within its borders had to be Chinese, had to have a Chinese culture and a Chinese writing. And we're going to see these ideals bounce back in our next unit whenever we start covering the Tang and the Song, and the Sui, I guess, but they're. All right, so that pretty much wraps up the Qin and the Han. Is that clear, or does anybody have any further questions about those two? Again, the questions, you can see them right over here for me. All right, guys, if we run out of questions, I'll give you guys about another 2 minutes to think of any. Oh, here we go. Anything else you think we should know, says Abby. And then Peter talking about the key concepts of the Silk Road. Well, Abby, good try. Anything else I think you should know? I think you should know the whole unit, but I'm biased. I tell you what, why don't I give you guys a little bit of a treat? You guys are doing extra work the night before a test, so why don't I look really quickly and say... I would make sure that you guys know the concept of patriarchy and how the patriarchy has affected each one of these different empires in their own different ways. In other words, what are the differing roles of men and women in each society, and how are either men or women gaining more power? So Abby, in response to your anything else you think we should know, I'd make sure to hit the patriarchy. Peter, the key concept of the Silk Road is what I'll be covering next. I'm just going to kind of go through the list. Christian, I will definitely cover, Kristen, I will definitely cover Persia next. Jimmy, I don't believe that's going to be on the test. And Luciana, the different Indian empires, I can definitely briefly go over those. So we're going to start off here with the concept of the Silk Road. And that's actually a really nice link from Han. The Han Dynasty is where we see the start of the Silk Road. Again, Han and Rome were pretty aware that the other one existed, but they were far enough apart that they didn't really mind too much as far as militaristic threat goes. But what does end up happening is between them in the steppes of Asia, you have a lot of nomadic peoples, people who move around a lot, nomadic pastoralists. And what they start to do is, because their borders aren't set like an empire's borders are set, is they start to have these what we call permeable borders, borders that they can kind of go back and forth across. And because that happens, you see a lot of diffusion of ideas and goods from one section of the world kind of branching across to the other. Now, the concept of the Silk Road is twofold. Number one, it's not a singular road. It's not like we had a very long road, for example, like the Royal Road going through Persia. Instead, it was a system of different trade routes, a lot of them through the nomadic peoples in the steppes of Asia, and some of them going down through the Indian Ocean, across into Africa, and then up into the Mediterranean. So all of these different land and sea routes are what we refer to as the Silk Road. The reason we do that is because the two terminal points on the ends, we have one in China and then one over in Rome, and the two of them were trading goods through other peoples to each other. One of them being silk from China, and one of them being intricate metalwork from Rome. So the key concept of that is basically that even with goods that you transport back and forth, that doesn't stop at goods. There are these unintentional consequences of trade that happen all the time. We have disease being spread, which leads to the downfall of the Roman Empire, leads to the downfall of the Athenian quasi-empire, leads to the downfall of quite a few empires. Disease is something that just completely decimates people, and the same disease that we see destroy Constantinople is the same disease that we're going to see destroy Europe come next unit. So these things do tend to also come across, as well as technologies. For example, the Dhow ship or the Lantine sails. These kind of ideas tend to transport across trade routes. So what's really important about the Silk Road is how much it took a large world that was disconnected and made it a lot more interconnected. Next up, we've got Persia. Okay, Persia's a little bit of a quagmire, and for some reason, Persia's that thing that you guys seem to have the most trouble with, and I get it. It's because it was kind of mentioned at the beginning, and we talked about it, and it fit in, but oh man, we had to talk about Greece, right? And we had to talk about Rome, and these are things that we just kind of gravitate towards. But Persia remains somewhat enigmatic to you guys. It's still got a lot of questions. So let's go over the basics of Persia. First, it takes over in the what we now call as the Middle East or Asia Minor, and it goes in and takes over the Assyrians, which were in Mesopotamia at the time. It takes over the Assyrian Empire and then pushes through and continues growing. It becomes the largest empire at that time, spanning roughly 3,000 miles from side to side. Now, with a big empire like this is the first time we've seen anything this big in all of history. They had to figure out how to rule. And the way that they kind of dealt with that, when we get to Darius I, he splits it up into what we call satrapies. And he puts satraps in control of each one of them. These satraps are generally going to be somebody who's local. And they're kind of like kings of their own little region, but they answer to the big king, if you had to kind of break it down into some simplistic terms. So the Persian Empire starts off with Cyrus the Great moving into all of these lands and conquering them. When he does conquer the Assyrians, he puts an end to what we know as the Babylonian captivity and returns the Jews from their diasporic community in Babylon back to Israel, or what is modern-day Israel. He does this, and he's very well liked for it, and eventually he does end up dying, and his son takes over, Egypt as well. Darius I puts in the satrapy system, and once he does that, he kind of does what we'd all love to do and retreats to his castle in Persepolis and just kind of chills there. He doesn't really want anything to do with the population, and he kind of places himself so far above the population that he is basically unapproachable. You had to go through a huge number of these steps just to walk up and talk to him without fear of getting killed. And even then, couldn't guarantee it. But what happens as Persia grows is that it's eventually going to bump borders with other expanding empires or other expanding civilizations. For example, the Mycenaean civilization that will eventually become to know as the Greek culture. Persia does take control of several of their cities, one of which is Ionia. And what ends up happening with Ionia is that once they take it over, the Ionians are kind of cool with it for a while. Then they kind of grumble about it, and they're not really super happy about it. But the Persians, they let people do their own thing as long as they're following Persia's rule. They put in roads, they tax people, but they put in roads, they improve infrastructure, they do all of this. So by and large, it wasn't too bad to be under Persia. But the Ionians weren't happy. They wanted to go back to their own ways. And they send some emissaries to Greece, or what we know as Greece, to kind of ask for some help. One of the emissaries in Sparta was turned down immediately because the 8-year-old daughter of the king of Sparta said, you need to send this guy packing because this is not a smart idea. And the king listens to this 8-year-old girl. Probably a good idea because Athens decides that it's going to be the champion of Ionia. So they encourage the Ionians to have this rebellion. So Ionians revolt and they're put down. They're put down so bad. And then Persia tries to figure out, well, the Ionians aren't going to do this by themselves. Who's helping them? And they realize that it's Athens doing it. So Persia starts to mount its forces, and Darius turns his eye to Greece. And this is where we get the start of the Greco-Persian Wars. And again, we've talked a little bit about the Greco-Persian Wars already, the rise of Alexander the Great. And then the next step of the Persian Empire is Alexander the Great sweeping in and conquering the entire thing. They were so weakened after fighting the Greco-Persian Wars, and they were also weak after siding with Sparta against Athens in the Peloponnesian Wars. They were so salty that even after they lost a 10-year war against Greece, or the Greek peninsula, they were so salty that they lost that, and they weren't even salty about all of Greece, just they wanted Athens to suffer. And, well, as we all know the story, Athens did eventually suffer. Got a couple of my Salyard kids. Hey, shout out to Salyards. I'll see you guys soonish. All right, and then next up we have Luciana is asking, can we briefly cover the different Indian empires? We can definitely briefly cover them. Both of them were, I'm not going to say brief, but in the scope of like Han China or Roman Empire, yeah, they're kind of brief. First up, we have the Maurin Empire. The Maurin Empire arises roughly, well, let's just say a couple of years after Alexander the Great invades what is now India. Once he gets into the Indus River Valley, this threat of this greater being comes in, and people are realizing in India that they have that common culture, they can be grouped together. And the Maurin Empire comes together with Chandragupta Maurya. He takes control of an area and starts to fight these wars of expansion. And those wars continue on until the emperor, which you should probably definitely know for tomorrow. His name is Ashoka. Ashoka is the oddity emperor that we will never come across again in all of our history. Eventually, we might come across people who are close to him, but he's the only one who's thus far fought this great bloody war of expansion and then immediately, as Mr. Bell says, felt bad about it and converted to Buddhism. He felt so bad about it and he converts to Buddhism, stops fighting these wars of expansion, and starts working on giving his people what they need to be better. Starts creating these educational systems, starts putting in roads, hospitals, infrastructure, and trying to improve everything within its borders. But after Ashoka, the Maurin Empire didn't have another strong leader, and so it collapses. It just slowly collapses. And then the Indian people, as we know them, their culture at that time, it stayed the same. We had Indian culture in the whole area. There was just no unified ruler. And that's kind of an abstract thought for Western history because most of the time it's one ruler and then eventually that state becomes another state. But as far as India was concerned there, the Indian peoples had the same culture but didn't have a unified ruler. So there's kind of this gap between the Maurin Empire and then far, far further, the Gupta Empire. So between them, there's roughly 300 to 500 years before the next empire starts. And the Guptas, they were a very interesting empire. They're unlike any of the other ones that we've really looked into. Every other empire expands through wars, expands through conquest, through military action. But the Gupta Empire, they do it a little bit differently. Rather than war, they go through diplomatic channels and they go through marriage to expand. And they expand for a good while. And the first ruler there, again, is Chandragupta. No relation to the first Chandragupta. Again, 300 to 500 years difference between the two of them. Not the same guy. So we have Gupta, and he takes over and starts to expand through marriage. And that continues on for a good deal longer than the Maurin Empire took place. I think the Gupta Empire lasts for about 300 years. Let's see. I've got a whole bunch of hellos. Hello again. Eggs Benedict, which, for the record, one of my favorite meals. Eggs Benedict asks, are trade routes on the test? Yes, trade routes will be on the test. I'm double checking real quick, but I'm pretty sure that what you need to know about trade routes is their impacts on things. And their impacts aren't necessarily just trade. Their impacts include those unintended consequences that we've been talking about. The trade route that, where are you? Ah, there we go. Make sure that you are aware of diffusion and syncretism for the trade routes. That's pretty much your golden guy. Lizzie, I know that you'd like a quick overview of the trans-Saharan trade. I'm going to be real nice to you right now and tell you, don't worry too much about it for this test. We will cover a lot more of the trans-Saharan trade network in our next unit, so that's really where we're going to harp on that on the test. Hello, my boy, spelled with an I, Wyatt. Specific examples of syncretism. Yul, I'm not going to tell you whether or not you need to know specific examples of syncretism, but what I can do really quickly for you is I can cover the ones that we've covered thus far in class. Number one, with Buddhism, as it transforms, as it moves out, it transforms. Ashoka puts up those edicts, the tablets all around. And yes, Eggs Benedict, I know that we expected more, but I know without a doubt that these trade networks are really going to be hit. I'm sorry that I had a pause from syncretism there. But yeah, I know you expected more on the trade routes, but this is the first half. What we've covered so far is like the first half of these trade networks. We've covered what they are, how they establish, but we haven't really covered their impact yet, their significance. So testing you on just kind of where they are, I feel is a little pointless. I'd rather test you guys on this when you know the impact of it, the significance of it. Otherwise, it's just information in a vacuum and it doesn't make sense. For syncretism, again, with Buddhism, as it moves from India into China, we'll see a lot of syncretic changes. For example, the original Buddha was probably thin, probably didn't have much hair because he followed a lot of paths that aesthetics at the time took. Again, aesthetics, not the people who were like, hey, check out aesthetics, the way that things look, but aesthetics in the sense of the Hindu tradition. They didn't eat much, they fasted a lot, they focused a lot on spirituality and focused a lot on communicating with the gods through their communication method, yoga, and prayer. So Buddha was probably an ascetic in appearance, meaning that he was very thin, kind of malnourished, and so a lot of Indian statues will depict him as such. But then when we start going into China, that's where we start to see those statues of what we lovingly call in class the fat Buddha. Kind of that Buddha that you'll see that you have the tradition of like rubbing its belly for good luck. That comes far down the line when it goes into China, and that's during the Tang Dynasty. Then you also have the example where we move Buddhism a little bit further into the Hellenic cultures, the Hellenistic cultures. And as it gets there, we have this interesting mix where we'll see statues of Buddha with Greek dress. So this kind of syncretism is really what I'm looking for. And we're going to kind of pay attention to that throughout the rest of it. This is a theme that we're going to see throughout the whole year. This is also going to be very impactful as we move into Europe. It'll be a lot more impactful as we move into the Americas, as we see that syncretic evolution of what Christianity is and what Buddhism becomes. All of this is going to change. And we're just now starting to see the start of that syncretism. Another example of syncretism would be whenever Buddhism and Hinduism kind of come together. Hinduism is kind of predisposed to absorb any religion that worked for it, because at the time, Buddha was a Hindu that kind of split off from that and created his own path. But Hinduism, you'll actually see depictions of Buddha as what we call the thousand-arm Buddha. And the statues of that are really cool if you want to look it up. I really appreciate the appearance of those statues. But these physical aspects are a way for these religions, these ideals, to be more approachable for the people that they're being given to. All right, we've got Dominic Wynn asking, what were the Nemo references that Mr. Bell and I came up with for the religions again? And if Mr. Bell is watching, he's probably crying right now, laughing, because we spent about half an hour after school debating what the different Chinese philosophies were if we represented them as Nemo characters. And we actually read into this and tried to figure it out. So the Nemo references for our 3 different Chinese philosophies. Number 1, we have Confucianism. Now, Confucianism is this kind of middle way where you focus on bettering yourself in order to better everything around you. Confucianists, we decided, were the Bruces, the sharks in Finding Nemo. Because remember, the Bruces are trying to make their lives better, and they're trying to take what they know is a bad aspect of themselves and fix it. They are saying fish are friends, not food. So they're trying to improve themselves in order to improve the community. Crush the Turtle is Taoism, and Ali is absolutely right about that. Crush the Turtle would be Taoism, because remember, Taoists were very much go with the flow kind of people. They were all about going back to nature, letting things take their natural course. There's going to be several different aspects of everything, but they're going to come together to form the whole. So things need to be natural. You need to like go with the flow, right? So Crush is all about that. You know, he's the turtle who's just like, hey, just ride the wave, man. And so the Taoists are very much Crush the Turtle. Following the Taoists, we now have the Legalists, the very rigid people, and we decided that was Marlin, Nemo's dad. The reason is that legalism is not just a harsh system of punishments and rewards. It's there because the ruler loves his people. So Nemo's dad imposes very harsh rules on him, and they were definitely overprotective. But the reason that he implemented these rules and these regulations on Nemo was that he was worried about Nemo and wanted to make sure that Nemo was protected. And that's pretty much what the legalists are. They portray everything that they talk about in a very positive light. Okay, again, I'm going to give you guys about another 2 minutes, and if there are no questions, I can go ahead and wrap this up. But I'll give you all about 2 minutes to drop in questions in case you have them. Ali, I have covered that a little earlier in the video. Once this posts up, it will be posted up fairly shortly. Once this posts up, you will be able to kind of scroll through and find it. I believe it was, I don't recall where in the video it was, but I definitely, we covered that not too long ago. Oh, Salyard's folks, say hi to everyone for me, please. That'd be awesome. No problem, Allie. All right. We got about another minute for any lingering questions before we move forward. For the Seleucid Empire, you need to know that it's one of the Hellenistic cultures. That's pretty much the long and short of it. The Seleucid Empire, we don't go too far into detail for this test. The difference between Hellenic and Hellenistic, Hellenic culture is referencing the culture of Helena, which is the island of, or not the, I'm sorry, the peninsula of Greece. So Greece proper is what we call the Hellenic culture. Whenever it moves out into Persia, into India, into Egypt, we call that the Hellenistic cultures because istic means like. So Hellenistic culture means Greek-like culture. So it's not quite Greek culture because it's not still there, and it takes on aspects of the cultures that they conquer. And this is what we refer to as the era following Alexander the Great and all of the empires that he conquered. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm about to wrap up here because I'm noticing that we're probably out of questions. If any of them pop up as I'm kind of wrapping up here, I'll address them before I go. But I did want to kind of draw your attention to this right here. For those of you who haven't yet Googled it, Memento Mori, the word is remember you will die. And I don't mean this in a bad way. I mean this in the way that it was used in the Roman Empire. Now, in the Roman Empire, you had these generals and these emperors who were larger than life. And what they aimed for was glory. What they aimed for was becoming even larger. For example, Julius the Caesar, not just content with controlling different lands and being heralded as this great general. Instead, he wanted to be the dictator. He wanted to be the top dog. He wanted to be dictator for life. He was, for the very short life that he had after he said that he was dictator for life. But the concept of memento mori is not one of fear. The concept of memento mori is one of balance. Tomorrow when you go into the test, I want you to memento mori, the same way that the Roman generals did. You see, these Roman generals, as they are gaining this glory, as they are gaining this conquest, they had somebody next to them, a slave, the lowest class in Rome, speaking into their ear, whispering, memento mori, memento mori, remember you will die. And they do this not because they're trying to scare the general, but because they're trying to remind them, yes, you've got this, but eventually. So tomorrow, just remember, you've got this. Don't worry about the eventually. All right, y'all, have a fantastic evening. Don't stay up too late. It's more important to have a long, healthy sleep and a good big breakfast than it is to stay up all night studying. If you stay up all night studying, what it ends up doing is warping your brain and you just can't remember everything. It's okay. Take the sleep over the study once you get to a point. Trust me. One more I'll address before I leave. We've got Kristen asking the city of Constantinople. What you need to know about the city of Constantinople is that once the Emperor Constantine takes control of the Roman Empire, he moves the capital city from Rome to Constantinople, named after, you guessed it, Emperor Constantine himself. He does that in order to combat the Seleucid Empire, which is next to Rome, and they are becoming kind of the rivals. And once Constantinople is there, this is where historians kind of start to bicker. You can say that the Roman Empire is no longer once it moves from Rome to Constantinople, but others say that it doesn't really collapse until their culture splits and you have the East and West Rome, and then West Rome falls, and it's a mess. But once Constantine moves it to Constantinople, I would say that kind of turns a thematic page. By and large, you need to know that it was the center of the Eastern Roman Empire. You need to know that Constantinople was one of the major kings there, and that eventually Justinian will become a major figurehead there. But we'll cover him next unit. So you need to know that it's a center for trade for right now. All right, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it was some help. I hope you guys do awesome on your test tomorrow. I know you will. You've been working hard. Have a great night.